Hey guys, welcome to another painting video. Today I will show you how to paint the Death Guard in their Pre-Heresy color scheme in dirty bone white armor with green accents. And I will show you an example on both a 40k and a 30k model, so whichever is your poison, you can paint them in the sick original color scheme.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANS Miniatures. We will start from either a fully white primer or a zenithal highlight. Both work just fine, but I prefer the zenithal since it helps me create some subtle transitions on the models without much effort. And if you want to know how to do a zenithal highlight like this, there is a dedicated video about it on the channel. I will begin by base coating all the colors on the model, starting with the most important element, the signature dirty white armor. I will be using pale sand for this, covering every panel that is supposed to be white, using multiple coats because even over a white primer, a light color like this is not gonna cover everything with a single coat. Essentially, I'm painting every armor panel except the shoulder guards with this. By the way, if you want to have the list of every color used in this video and follow along with every step of the process at your own pace, then there is a detailed PDF guide about this project on my Patreon with everything you need to replicate what I did here. If that sounds good, check it out. Now that we have blocked in the main color, it's time for the second most important element in the scheme, the olive colored panels. I used medium olive green for these. It's up to you which panels you want to cover, but it's important to keep the majority of them white and paint only a couple of them green. On the official color scheme, the shoulder portions are green, so that was an obvious choice for the biggest green bits, and I went with that. Other than that, I wanted to have at least one more green element a little further down the models as well, and ideally in a somewhat symmetrical position. In the case of the 30k model, it was the disc or huge belt buckle thing in the middle of the torso. On the 40k model, there was nothing obvious in the middle since the belly is a bit too big to be green, so I went with the inside of the knee guards on both sides. For the third color, we will be tackling the last signature element of this color scheme, the bronze armor trim. At this point, I treated the two models the same, using red to paint the trim on both of them. The reason for this is that I was planning to do a non-metallic metal trim on both, and this dark reddish brown color is a great starting point for that. But later I decided that I would paint the 40k model with true metallics and only do the Pre-Heresy version in fancy non-metallic metal, so I can have an example for both styles. I figure that the majority of you guys watching this will think that painting non-metallic metal is too difficult and you want to see how to do it with standard metal colors. So if you are only interested in painting yours with true metallics, you can have this step painted in either whole red or simply black. Both will work equally well. I painted the cloaks of both models with burnt red. This requires quite a few layers until it gets fully covered, but it's very important to not get lazy on this if you want a nice bright red color and smooth finish. I also painted the tabard on the 40k model and the hood covering most of his helmet as well. Then all the cables on both models got a couple of coats of sun red. This is a vibrant dark orange color and it will give us a nice basis to work from for some hazard stripes later on. We are not painting Iron Warriors, but you can never go wrong with a couple of hazard stripes on Heretic or Chaos models. All the steel or iron bits are not as important as the bronze trim for the color scheme, but there are still a lot of them on both of these guys. I used pure black to cover all of them. This will be a good undercoat for both non-metallic and true metallic metals. I used chocolate to paint all the bone and wood elements, the shaft of the scythe, the horns jutting out of the 40k model's armor, and the skulls on the Heresy dude's shoulder rack. Finally, I painted a couple of unique things on both. On the 30k model, I painted the white skull symbol on the left shoulder pad with silver grey. This will be pure white later on, and this bright grey color will be a good base to shade and highlight from. There are definitely no pure white things on the 40k model, so instead I used mahogany to cover all the disgusting bits in the cracks of his armor plus the skin on the head dangling from his belt. Finally, I covered both bases with some terrain paste. I used spring soil from scale 75 for this, but any mud-like terrain product will work just fine.
And with that, we are done with base coating everything. They look kinda messy and undefined at this stage, but that's okay. Now we can refine everything and start adding details.
In that spirit, before I did anything else, I thinned down some black paint and I did some rough black lining. I simply painted this with the tip of the brush into the corners where different panels meet and also into the deeper crevices, cracks and grooves of the armor. Don't worry if you make some mistakes with this, since at this point we also have the perfect opportunity to do some cleanup on the model, since we still have all the base paint sitting on the wet palette. So as you go around panel lining, whenever you make a mistake or if you see that you had misplaced some brush strokes on the panels where they don't belong, you can simply cover them up with the base color. And you don't have to spend a lot of time on this, since you can still correct any mistakes in the highlighting stage as well, but it's easier to start from a neater baseline. For example, I spent around 20 minutes doing these two models. And now that we have made them a little cleaner, it's time to mess them up in true Death Guard fashion, dealing with the biggest element, the white armor first. I took some Seraphim sepia for this step since it's basically made for this. I didn't use this out of the pot, instead I put it on the wet palette and thinned it down a little bit with water. Then I covered the whole panel with it, but I brushed it away from the bigger surfaces and dragged it down towards the bottom of the panel and around the rivets. Ideally, everything should get a filter of yellowish brown with this, but it should be strongest at the bottom of the panels and especially around the rivets. So I even added a little extra around there once the first round had dried. You can go more or less messy with this by diluting it less or not at all, or even by adding a second layer, but be careful because it's easy to go too far and at some point it won't look like dirty white armor but just a brown-yellow mess. That being said, just Seraphim Sepia is not gonna be dirty enough for us, so time to take out some Beast Brown and mess it up even more. I used it slightly thinned down and painted it into the crevices where the two armor panels meet, or where the white panels meet a different colored element like the armor trim. Once again, it's important to not overuse this. The majority of the weathering should come from the Seraphim Sepia. This should cover much less surface, maybe 20-30%. I also use this to create marks on the armor to make it look like it's damaged. Sometimes I made a little horizontal scratch and with the tip of the brush dragged small drops down, like the rust is dripping down from a crack. But you don't have to do it in the middle of the panel, you can also just start this effect from the trim as well. And of course, on the 40k model you can drop this into the pitted holes on the armor panels as well, making it look like the dirt and the rust accumulated there. Now to enhance this effect even more, I took a brighter version of the same color, orange-brown, and I painted it inside the marks I made previously, but I tried to cover only the middle of the darker color so it remained still visible around the brighter one. I didn't do it everywhere, only where there was enough space inside the darker marks to place this.
Okay, now the armor is properly messed up and looks fit to be worn by the 14th Legion, so it's time to do some highlights.
As usual, we start with the white armor and I will use the original pale sand again. Now that we have the panels shaded, they are actually darker than our base coat, so this color now acts as a highlight. I painted all the edges and the rivets with this, plus I added small scratches and marks on the panels that had enough space for them. I also outlined the bottom of the weathering marks I made in the previous step to give them some depth. This color will be subtle and the highlights won't stand out too much, which is good for us. This means that we can also clean up the armor a bit, obscuring any obvious mistakes we made in the previous step. I went a little brighter with the final highlights using ivory. I didn't paint this all over the armor, only on the edges that were facing up towards the light. I also tried to make these highlights neater and slightly thinner than the previous ones so they don't fully obscure what I did in the previous step. It is important to not go too crazy with the highlights and not make the armor too neat and clean looking, otherwise they will end up looking like dark angels and that would be pretty shameful. Moving on to the green highlights, here our life is a bit easier since we left these panels relatively clean. I did this intentionally, I like the contrast between the clean green and the dirty white panels. But if you want to make it dirtier, you can simply cover them with a little Plague Bearer's Flesh contrast during the shading and weathering phase. But since I didn't use the shade on the green, I needed to go with a slightly brighter color for the first highlight compared to the base coat. Olive green is only a shade brighter, so it's quite subtle, but once again this allows us to make corrections if there are any mistakes and we can draw pretty thick highlights without it looking terrible. With the next highlight using Green Sky, I jumped quite a bit in brightness and used this pastel green to highlight the edges, but this time much thinner. I also added small scratches and dots where I had space for it, to make the surface a little more interesting. Now we have the white and the green panels highlighted, it's time for the third color in the scheme, the bronze armor trim. Since most of you probably want to see the true metallic version, I will only give a brief overview of how I did the non-metallic metal and then I will show the true metallics in more detail. If you want to know more about the NMM, check out the guide on Patreon. I might even do a video there dedicated to this because I think it turned out quite neat. For the bronze, I highlighted up the trim with lighter and lighter orange-brown colors, going into ice yellow and white on the top of the panels and in the highest highlights. When I was done, I used some dark sea blue glazes to darken it down and add some additional tones and verdigris effect. For the dark steel or iron, I came up with a recipe I had not used before. It started with some burnt umber through some green grays up to ivory and pure white in the highest highlights, and later adding some rust effects to make it more interesting looking. The true metallic version is much less fun, but it's much simpler to do. I covered all the bits that were supposed to be bronze with Balthazar gold. This color is quite dark and covers well, so you only really need a single coat, just don't try to dilute it too much. For all the steel, I used everyone's favorite lead belcher. Just like the Balthazar gold, this covers quite well with a single coat over the black, so it takes only a couple of minutes to finish the two models. Once I was done with them, I took some Reichland flesh shade and covered the gold bits fully and quite thickly. Then I did the same thing on the steel, but this time using a generous amount of non oil. It is important to give the shades time to dry before you start working on these surfaces again. Then using Balthazar gold again, I re-established the gold, painting it back on most of the raised surfaces and on the edges, but leaving the shaded areas untouched in the deepest parts. After that was done, I did the same with Brass Scorpion, but this time I tried to make the highlights smaller and thinner inside the previous ones. Finally, I used some Stormhost silver and painted this only on the most prominent edges where the light would reflect the most. The steel bits were even simpler. I used Iron Hand steel and I painted back all the raised parts on the steel elements with it, leaving the shaded bits only in the shadows and between the panels. Finally, I switched to Stormhost silver again and I did smaller highlights and edge highlights with it inside the previous ones. And since we are painting Death Guard, it was time to mess up what I had just done with some simple weathering effects which can be done on both the non-metallic and the true metallic versions. On the steel bits I took some orange colors and diluted them a little. Then I dropped them into the crevices and corners where the panels meet. First the darker one on a larger area and then the lighter one inside the previous one, but without fully covering it. Diluted, you can simply paint this over elements like the chainmail and it will flow inside the links, and it will also just flow inside the crevices and edges as if the corrosion had settled there. As usual, just be careful not to overdo this, less can be more, otherwise you can overpower the metals and make them look like they are actually an orange color. You can do the same effect on the bronze bits as well and make them look like bronze and not gold by using some blue-green colors. Thin down, just like the oranges in the previous step, you can drop them around the rivets of the trim and the corners and edges. Adding lighter and lighter colors on increasingly smaller surfaces, it will look like the verdigris has settled in those deeper areas over time. These simple little effects will make the models much more interesting to look at while also making them more authentically Death Guard as well.
With that, we finished the most important elements of the scheme, so let's briefly run through some of the other colors that are still important to the final look.
I painted the white symbol on the shoulder of the Heresy model by covering it with Briar Queen Chill contrast and then highlighting it up with first ivory and then finally with pure white on the edges and the rivets. The red capes, hood and tabard I highlighted up with brick red, carmine and blood red. I blocked in the highlights on the folds first, then I glazed a couple of layers from the side to smooth it out before I moved on to the next brighter color and did the same thing again on a smaller surface. On the 40k model, to make the cape more dirty and sinister looking, I thinned down some dark sea blue to a glaze and started dragging it towards the bottom of the cape. When the first layer dried, I did it again but started it further down inside the bluish area I established with the first one. I repeated this until the bottom was completely dark blue-green. I did all the skulls and horns in a pretty standard way, highlighting them up with Zendri dust and Shabti bone and then glazing them with Rhinox hide. I did the hazard stripes on the cables by first highlighting the top of the cables up with volcanic yellow, but leaving the parts facing down and in the deepest parts in the original orange. Then I added smaller highlights on the parts facing up with deep yellow, leaving the previous darker yellow visible around it. Finally, with some pure black, I started painting black bands around the cables. I was trying to space them out evenly and make them the same width, but I messed up quite a bit. And when I did, I corrected it with some deep yellow, going back and forth with the black and the yellow until I was more or less happy with it. And with that, our favorite Sick Boys were done in their glorious 30k color scheme, and the end result looks like this. Let me know which one you like more, but personally I am partial to the non-metallic metal 30k version. I think Mortarion would approve of that one.
I hope you guys enjoyed this guide. If you did, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe. And as a reminder, there is an 87-page PDF version of this guide on my Patreon with every little detail. So if you want to paint your Death Guard this way, check that out. Also, my Patreon members are the ones that make this channel possible, so I want to give them a huge shout out as always, especially to the ones in the captain level. Thank you for watching and for your support. See you guys in the next one.